20 nuclear missiles went offline in 8 days. No malfunction, no power failure, and no explanation. Boeing sent their best engineers to check it out. They tore that system apart. Found nothing wrong. The missiles were, in the lead engineer's exact word, perfect. The Air Force told him to stop investigating and don't file a report. Strategic Air Command's own classified telex, obtained years later, said this: "The fact that no apparent reason for the loss of 10 missiles can be readily identified is cause for grave concern to this headquarters." And both times it happened, security guards on the surface reported the same thing: an unidentified object, glowing, silent, hovering directly over the missile silos. This is Malmstrom Air Force Base, March 1967, in central Montana, the height of the Cold War, 60 feet beneath the frozen plains. Air Force officers sat in reinforced underground capsules, each one responsible for 10 Minuteman I intercontinental ballistic missiles tipped with nuclear warheads. These men were the last link in the chain of command. If the order came from the president, they'd turn their keys and the whole world would end. On the morning of March 16th, at around 8:45 a.m., every single missile in Echo flight, all 10 of them, simultaneously dropped off strategic alert status. The indicators on the commander's console flipped from green to red. No go. Channels 9 and 12 on the voice reporting signal assembly, the VRSA, it's unlaunchable. 10 nuclear weapons rendered inert in a span of roughly 10 to 40 seconds. No sequence, no pattern, just off. Seconds earlier, a security guard had radioed down from the surface to report a large, round object hovering directly over one of the missile silos. 8 days later, it happened again. A different flight, a different crew, the same result. 10 more missiles went dark, and this time, the guard on the surface was so terrified he could barely speak. Welcome to Under Observation. I'm Devin. Over the past 3 episodes, we've started building a pattern. The Nimitz Tic Tac showed us what happens when the most advanced sensors in the Navy track something they can't identify. Rendlesham Forest shows us what happens when the encounter occurs at a nuclear installation. Something sends beams of light into the weapon's storage area. The Ariel School encounter showed us what happens when 62 children describe beings delivering a warning about our entire planet. Today, we're diving a bit deeper into that nuclear connection, to a case where the phenomenon didn't just appear near nuclear weapons, it apparently turned them off. This is the Malmstrom Air Force Base incident of March 1967. Before we get into it, this case is messy. The 2 primary witnesses cannot agree on what happened, and we'll get into that a bit later, but they cannot agree. The dates have even been confused by the people who were there. The Air Force says the whole UFO angle was disproven. I'm going to walk through all of it: the testimony, the contradictions, the engineering investigation, and what the classified documents actually say. By the end, you can, hopefully, decide for yourself what happened 60 feet below Montana. Malmstrom Air Force Base sits just east of Great Falls, Montana, and in 1967 it was home to the 341st Strategic Missile Wing, part of Strategic Air Command, the arm of the Air Force responsible for America's nuclear deterrent. The base operated 150 Minuteman I ICBMs, that intercontinental ballistic missile we mentioned earlier, spread across thousands of square miles of Montana countryside. That's terrifying. Don't want to live near that. These missiles were organized into flights of 10. Each flight was controlled from an underground launch control facility, a hardened capsule called a launch control center, buried 60 feet below the surface and connected to the 10 missile silos by miles of underground cabling. The capsule was mounted on shock absorbers designed to absorb the impact of a nearby nuclear detonation. The idea was that even if the Soviets hit Montana with a nuclear strike, the crew below could survive long enough to launch a retaliatory response. Understand that in terms of engineering, this was not a fragile system. That's why the Cold War was so tense. This was a hardened, redundancy-filled technology that the United States built themselves. multiple independent power systems, backup diesel generators at every silo, communication lines that were impenetrable. I mean, for all 10 missiles to just go offline, not in sequence, not in a pattern, not in a, hey, what's going on here? We're tinkering, just off. Something had to bypass that. Now, was it a person? I don't know. With all the redundancies built in, I don't think so. They wouldn't just let somebody flip the switch. I mean, the military knows that people question their decisions. So, I think Boeing engineer Robert Kaminsky, who investigated the Echo flight shutdown, put it pretty explicitly. The use of backup power systems and other technical system circuit operational redundancies strongly suggests that this kind of event is virtually impossible once the system is up and running. And as a software engineer, I can agree. We typically do not say if you shut one thing off, the whole thing goes off. Some of you may have heard of the term microservices. I mean, applications are made to scale. We do not just shut the whole thing down. It's typically abstracted, and each segment is responsible for itself, is the best way to put it. So it was virtually impossible once that system was up and running to just beep boop and it's all off. Every launch control center was manned around the clock by a 2-person crew, a missile combat crew commander, and a deputy missile combat crew commander. Their job was to monitor the status of their 10 missiles continuously on a console that displayed each missile's alert condition. Green meant, yep, good to go. Red meant, no go. The missile was offline and could not be launched. These men trained for one scenario above all others: the authenticated launch order from the President of the United States. That order came. Both officers had to turn their launch keys simultaneously. The keys were placed far enough apart that one person could not reach both. Again, they know that people ask those decisions. They wonder, they think, do I do this? You don't want one person swaying one way or the other, such as, hey, let me grab your key and destroy the world. You needed a system for this, and they had it. The keys were far enough apart that one person could not reach both. And that's how close these men sat to the nuclear trigger every day, was on standby for the call. In March of 1967, 2 separate crews at 2 different flights would watch the entire console go red, and neither crew will ever be able to explain why. But before we get to what happened underground, I need to tell you about what was happening on the surface. Because the UFO reports at Malmstrom didn't begin on March 16th. They never do. The events that we know of are simply the apex most of the time. The events at Malmstrom have been going on for weeks. I think this is a detail that a lot of retellings of the story skip entirely, but really, really important for context. In the weeks leading up to the Echo flight shutdown, there'd been a steady stream of UFO reports from the security personnel at Malmstrom's various sites. Guards posted at remote silos out in the Montana countryside were reporting lights in the sky, objects maneuvering, important detail, maneuvering at low altitude, things that they couldn't identify. The reports were being logged, but they weren't being taken seriously. Again, the Air Force said, nope, it's disproven, not a big deal, no UFO here. But UFO reports from guys standing alone in a field at 3 a.m. in Montana, they were never going to be prioritized. And the Echo flight shutdown didn't come out of nowhere. It was the escalation point. It was the apex. They just didn't prioritize the info. There's actually a declassified Air Force staff message from this period documenting the Malmstrom received multiple reports of UFOs in the Great Falls, Montana area. That's declassified Air Force staff message that exists. This is the Air Force's own internal communication acknowledging ongoing UAP activity near the base. It's not fringe testimony, it is literally like institutional documentation. So, now that it's obvious that above ground things were heating up and it wasn't just a randomized event, the morning of March 16th, 1967, Echo flight. The 2 officers on duty in the Underground Launch Control Center were Captain Eric Carlson, the commander, and First Lieutenant Walter Figel, the deputy. What happens next depends on who you ask, and it's the entire reason the Malmstrom case gets really complicated. because the two men who were sitting side by side in the same capsule tell very different stories. I'm going to give you both, and I'm going to do my best not to sanitize it. Here's what Figel says. Figel said this on tape. These aren't secondhand accounts. Researcher Robert Hastings recorded approximately 3 hours of telephone interviews with Figel between 2008 and 2010, and the recordings are public. Figel's words aren't being paraphrased here in the tapes through someone else's book or filtered through a journalist's article. You can listen to the man describing exactly what happened from his own perspective. That's a primary source, and that level of primary source of verified evidence is pretty rare. I mean, we've got, lots of accounts, but a David Fravor of a case, a Figel, it's pretty rare. So according to Figel, he was monitoring the console when he received a call from a security guard posted at one of the Echo missile silos. Launch facilities, as they're called, each designated with a letter and number. The guard reported seeing a large, round object hovering directly over the site. In Figel's own words from the tape recording, he seemed to be serious, and I wasn't taking him seriously. Figel's like, okay. Figel thought the guard was messing with him. He told Hastings, I wouldn't say panicked or anything like that. I was thinking he was yanking my chain more than anything else. But he followed protocol. He dispatched 2 security alert teams, 2-man armed response units and pickup trucks to the silo to investigate. At least one of those teams radioed back and confirmed the sighting. They saw the object too. Then the missiles started going down. At approximately 8:45 a.m., the first missile status indicator on Figel's console flipped from green to red. It's a no-go. Then a second, then the rest. Within an estimated 10 to 40 seconds, all 10 Minuteman I missiles and Echo flight were offline. Channels 9 and 12, which relate to, again, the VRSA, the guidance and control systems, showed fault across every single missile simultaneously. This is pretty technically important. The channels monitored the logic couplers, so electronic components that managed command signals to the missiles. Channel 9 and 12 no-go meant that the guidance and control systems had experienced some kind of disruption at the most fundamental level. It was not a power failure. The backup generators were fine. Again, they had every redundancy you can imagine. It wasn't a communication break. The crew still had contact with the command post. Something specifically affected the logic couplers across all 10 missiles simultaneously without any identifiable cause. There were also minor anomalies that morning that didn't seem directly connected, but added to all the confusion. A secondary door actuator motor failed at launch facility E2. One silo, E8, was already running on backup diesel power and experienced intermittent generator issues. But none of these correlated with the full flight shutdown. The investigation would later confirm that the failures were unique to Echo flight. No other flights in the wing were affected. So Figel was then debriefed along with Carlson back at Malmstrom after all of this happens. During the debriefing, according to Figel, they were told, don't discuss the incident. On the tape, Figel confirmed to Hastings that Carlson was sitting no more than 2 feet away from him and heard all the same radio communications from the security teams. They both heard the UFO report come in. They both heard the confirmation from that security alert team. The contradiction that's at the center of this is Captain Eric Carlson, the man sitting 2 feet from Figel who heard the same report come in. He consistently and emphatically denies that any UFO was ever involved in the incident. He says the missile failures were a technical malfunction. He says he doesn't recall any UFO reports from the security teams. Says he never even discussed UFOs with Figel. 2 men, same capsule, same morning, 2 very different accounts. Carlson hasn't just passively denied it either. His son, James Carlson, has become the most vocal skeptical critic of the entire Malmstrom UFO narrative. James has published a lot online, and arguing that his father is telling the truth and that Robert Salas, Robert Hastings, and everyone who claims UFO involvement are fabricating or exaggerating that. His son believes that. James has accused Hastings of doctoring the Figel tapes, a claim Hastings denies and which the publicly available recordings don't appear to support. Carlson's family's position is pretty clear and firm. No UFOs, period. But Figel's tape recording exists. They're public. They are declassified information, and on them, a retired colonel, Figel, eventually achieved the rank of colonel, describes receiving and confirming a UFO report during the exact time frame of the missile shutdown. It's not hearsay, primary source, and it's documented. I don't really know who's right. We're probably never, ever going to know who's right, but one person says it happened. There's recordings of the security report existing, and they were told, do not talk about it. Don't make a report, don't talk about it. And Carlson said, you got it. Yes, sir. How can I help you, sir? And he saluted, and it never happened. It's possible. But if the witness testimony were all we had, the Malmstrom case would be just another he said, she said dispute. Or, I guess, he said dispute. There's an engineering layer to this that elevates it beyond just witness disagreements. Because, again, Boeing investigated this event. And what they found, or didn't find, makes it pretty extraordinary. Boeing was the primary contractor for the Minuteman missile system. When Echo Flight went down, they dispatched an engineering investigation team to Malmstrom. Team was assembled from Boeing's best missile systems engineers, along with personnel from the Oklahoma City Air Material Area Autonetics, which made the missile guidance systems and the 15th Air Force. This was not some simple review. It was a full-scale engineering investigation involving multiple organizations. The team leader at the time was Robert Kaminsky, and what Kaminsky found, or again didn't find, should have been the front page news. In a 1997 letter to researcher Jim Klotz, Kaminsky wrote, "At the outset, the team quickly noticed a lack of anything that would come close to explain why the event occurred. There were no significant failures, engineering data, or findings that would explain how 10 missiles were knocked off alert. And they checked everything and found nothing wrong. The missiles were functional. Power systems were fine. The cabling was completely intact. The guidance systems, when tested right after the incident, worked perfectly. There was no technical explanation for why 10 missiles simultaneously went offline." I think the lack of findings here separates Malmstrom at least a little bit from something like, say, Rendlesham Forest. Rendlesham is a very, I saw some lights in the sky, it could have been a lighthouse, maybe it wasn't, and here's my tape recording, I'm terrified, but that's about as far as it went. In this case, an engineering team comes in and says, no, there's no reason for this failure, paired with someone saying, yeah, a security team alerted to an object flying over the missile silos, and now we're checking it out, and then the missiles went off. This shouldn't have happened, and we cannot explain how it happened. That's not an interpretation. That's Boeing's official conclusion. So, do we have proof? No, but we also don't have anti-proof. Kaminsky's account doesn't stop, though, at the technical findings. He also reported that he was connected by a Boeing Air Force liaison named Don Peterson, who told him something that changed the context of the entire investigation. The incident was being reported as a UFO event. Airmen had reported seeing unidentified objects over the launch facilities at the time the missiles went down. And then, according to Kaminsky, the Air Force interrupted his investigation midstream. He was ordered not to write a final engineering report on the full flight. The investigation was effectively shut down before it reached a conclusion. Think about what that means. The Air Force's own contractor is saying, we've tested everything, can't explain it. An intermediary tells the lead engineer, hey, by the way, probably a UFO. And then the Air Force says, stop. Full stop. Don't investigate, no report. That sequence is either a crazy coincidence in military engineering history, or someone didn't want the engineering investigation and the UFO reports to appear in the same document. And Kaminsky wasn't some junior engineer. He wasn't starting his career. He was the team lead on full-scale investigation into the failure of 10 nuclear weapons. For the Air Force to shut down his investigation before completion, again, 10 nuclear weapons, lead. He's the team lead. To shut down his investigation before completion means somebody with serious authority said shut it down. You don't suppress an engineering report on a nuclear weapons failure, especially not casually, and they just wrote it off. Someone in the chain of command decided that the risk of what the report might conclude was greater than the risk of leaving a 10 missile failure unexplained. So, pretty big details to need to cover up. And then, if one time wasn't enough, 8 days after Echo Flight, it happens again. Oscar Flight. The evening of March 24th, 1967. The crew on duty now was Captain Fred Mywald as Missile Combat Crew Commander, and the first lieutenant was Robert Salas as deputy. Salas was 26 years old, and he was an Air Force Academy graduate, but he was in his second year as a missile launch officer. He wasn't brand new. And Salas actually initially believed he was at Echo Flight on March 16th. It wasn't until other witnesses were identified, specifically Figel and Carlson, that Salas determined he was actually at Oscar Flight on March 24th. The confusion there from Salas, occurring decades after the fact, is understandable, but is also pretty powerful and has been used aggressively by critics to undermine his overall credibility. As a faithful skeptic, I do have to take everything with a grain of salt, and to me, there is a gut feeling that says, well, you were brand new to the military, you should have been fresh, relatively brand new. Why can't you remember the dates? Everyone around you would have been telling you to get it together, remember. These were nuclear missile silos. It's understandable, it's decades later, but it is pretty hard to take in if you're a faithful skeptic. Not in the sense that you want it to not be true, but in the sense that you need proof, real proof. So I'm going to tell you about that just so that you can factor it into your own assessment and so I don't glaze over it. I mean, I would also push back on the idea that it invalidates Salas' account. I can barely remember what I ate 2 days ago sometimes. Probably just a me problem, but that's the reality of it. And getting the date wrong 30 years later, while correctly remembering pretty much all the events, the personnel, the sequence, the emotional experience, it's pretty consistent with how real human memory works. Might not be a character flaw. Also, people who have perfect memories of things, I mean, down to every detail, how much did you fabricate there? Not often to have photographic perfect memory. So, to me, it's acceptable, but it's questionable. Regardless, here's what Salas describes. He was on duty in the underground capsule when he received the first call from his flight security controller, guard posted at the topside security station above the launch control facility. The guard reported seeing strange lights in the sky, moving erratically above the missile field. Salas told him to keep watching and report back if anything changed. He didn't really think much of it. A few minutes later, the guard called again. And Salas has described the second call in virtually every interview he's given for the past 30 years, always in pretty much the same terms. Guard was frightened, not curious, not confused, scared. Salas has said the man was scared to death and barely able to speak coherently. The guard reported that a glowing, red-orange pulsating object, roughly 30 to 40 feet across, was hovering silently directly over the front gate of the launch control facility. The security guards on the surface had already drawn their weapons. The object made no sound, had no visible means of propulsion. It was just there, and it was terrifying them. Salas woke Captain Mywald and told him what was happening. Before they could decide on any course of action, their console started lighting up. One by one, the indicators flipped to no-go. All 10 missiles in Oscar Flight dropped off strategic alert status. The same pattern as Echo Flight 8 days earlier. Salas was 60 feet underground. He didn't see the object himself. Salas is only a first-hand witness of the missile shutdown. He did watch that happen on his console. He's a second-hand witness to the UFO. His account of the object is pretty much entirely from what the security guard told him over the phone, but luckily we have the first event, and the connection between the two events relies on the timing and the guard's testimony. Luckily, Salas is not the only witness to Oscar Flight. It isn't just, a somebody said something case. Captain Fred Mywald, his commander that night, confirmed that the missile shut down on tape in conversations with Robert Hastings. Mywald has been a little bit more reserved than Salas in public, but his confirmation that the shutdown occurred is on the record. And there's a third witness who adds a different dimension to the Oscar Flight incident. First Lieutenant Robert Jamison was a combat targeting team commander assigned to the 341st Missile Maintenance Squadron at Malmstrom. His job was to physically travel to missile silos and perform retargeting operations. Effectively, he programmed the guidance systems. When a flight went down, Jamison's team was part of the response that brought the missiles back online. Jamison states that he assisted in the restart of an entire flight of 10 Minuteman ICBMs that had simultaneously and inexplicably shut down, an event he places near Lewiston, Montana, consistent with Oscar's flight location. But here's what makes Jamison's testimony even more unique. He describes what happened before his team was dispatched. According to Jamison, while his and other targeting teams were preparing to respond to the stricken flight, they were ordered, as a precaution, to remain at Malmstrom until all UFO reports from the field had ceased. They couldn't leave the base until the objects were gone. He also states that his team received a special briefing before being dispatched, during which they were directed to immediately report any UFO sighted while traveling to or from missile sites. Jamison further states that he subsequently spoke with several security guards who had witnessed UFO-related incidents. His description of them, all of the guards, visibly shaken. Jamison's testimony, first, it corroborates that UFO reports were actively being made and apparently taken seriously, even though they were debunked and cast aside. You also don't issue stand-down orders over weather balloons, so couldn't have been that. Second, Jamison experienced this from the operations side, not the command capsule. He is a third independent perspective confirming that something was happening at Malmstrom's missile sites that week. Something happened there. We don't have proof of what, but we have proof that something happened there. But enough speculation. Where does the official record stand? Because the Air Force has a very specific position on what happened, which directly contradicts multiple witnesses. Typical. The 341st Strategic Missile Wing Unit history, the official record of the unit's operations, contains this specific statement. Rumors of unidentified flying objects around the area of Echo Flight during the time of the fault were disproven. It further states that a mobile strike team inspecting the launch facilities stated that no unusual activities or sightings were observed. That's it. Just those two sentences. Disproven and no unusual activity. Case closed. See you later. Why are you even looking? Except Walter Figel says he dispatched security alert teams and at least one confirmed the sighting. Robert Jamison says his targeting teams were held at base until UFO reports ceased. Robert Salas says his security guard was scared to death by a glowing object over the gate. And the Air Force's own staff message from the period documents multiple reports of UFOs in the Great Falls, Montana area. The unit history doesn't say how the UFO rumors were disproven. Doesn't reference any investigations into the sightings, does not address the witness testimony. It literally just says they were disproven, no unusual activity, and moves on. It's a pattern we've seen before, which is why I hold such a stance on it. In Rendlesham, the UK Ministry of Defence said the incident posed no threat to national security, but the Deputy Base Commander's own memo described beams of light directed at a nuclear weapons storage area. At Malmstrom, similar. The official record says UFO rumors were disproven, yet multiple witnesses, again on tape, describe confirmed sightings. So the gap between the official record and the witness testimonies, well, it's a pattern now. One thing to have one case where there's indiscriminate testimonies versus, he said, she said. But now in multiple cases, the Ministry of Defense, the Air Force, they're all saying, nope, didn't happen. And yet the people there are saying, yep, sure did happen. Either the witnesses are wrong or the official record is incomplete. And I'm thinking it's the latter. Now, up to this point, I've technically only been telling you about one case. 2 incidents, but one case. And those 2 incidents were at one base in 1 week in 1967. But Malmstrom isn't an isolated event. It's one data point in a pattern that stretches across 7 decades and multiple continents. And when you see that full pattern, Malmstrom stops being an anomaly and starts looking like a node or a chapter in a much larger story. Robert Hastings, a researcher who has dedicated over 50 years to this single question, has interviewed more than 170 military veterans who were directly involved in UAP-related incidents at nuclear weapons sites. He didn't interview people who heard stories. not people who read about it. He interviewed people who were there, launch officers, security guards, maintenance technicians, targeting team commanders. On September 27th, 2010, Hastings organized a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. 7 former U.S. Air Force personnel stood before the media and described, on camera, their first-hand experiences with UFO incursions at nuclear weapons sites. CNN live-streamed the event. Captain Robert Salas was one of the speakers. Captain Robert Jamison was another. The pattern they described begins actually in 1945, which is interesting. It's actually before Roswell, before the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when UFO activity was reported at a plutonium processing facility in Hanford, Washington. The pattern then continues through the 50s and 60s at nuclear test ranges in Nevada and the Pacific. It appears at ICBM bases across the Great Plains throughout the entire Cold War. It even surfaces at Rendlesham Forest in 1980, which we covered in episode 2. That pattern also extends into our modern era. The most recent case Hastings investigated actually occurred on October 23rd, 2010. It's actually less than a month after his National Press Club press conference. F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne, Wyoming temporarily lost the ability to communicate with 50, so not 10 this time, 50 of its Minuteman III missiles. It's not a mistake. 50 missiles. A ninth of America's entire nuclear arsenal went dark. The ninth of that can destroy the world. Hey, we're just going to shut it off. The Air Force officially attributed the problem to a hardware component that had been improperly replaced by a technician. They said this time, the outage in 2010 lasted 59 minutes. Much different than the 40 seconds. But according to Hastings, the communications disruption actually lasted several hours. Much, much longer than the Air Force publicly admitted. And during the disruption, multiple maintenance teams in the field reported seeing a huge, cigar-shaped craft maneuvering high above the missile field. So we've got Tic Tacs before we've publicly accepted Tic Tacs. I mean, the pattern is there. A military officer briefed on the event told The Atlantic, "We've never had something as big as this happen. We can deal with, maybe 5, 6, or 7 at a time, but we've never lost complete command and control or functionality of 50 whole ICBMs." The incident was serious enough for President Obama to be personally briefed. So this made it all the way up the chain of command. This was a real event. The witnesses described the object as similar in shape to a World War I German Zeppelin. Long, narrow, cigar-shaped, but with no passenger gondola, no advertising, and no features consistent with what would definitely represent a commercial blimp. Their squadron commander warned them, don't talk to journalists or researchers about the things they may or may not have seen, and threatened severe penalties for violations. 1945, 1967, 1980, 2010. The nuclear pattern spans 65 years. The locations span 3 different continents, at least. The witnesses number in the hundreds, and the pattern is always the same. Unidentified objects appearing at nuclear weapons facilities, sometimes demonstrating an ability to affect the weapon systems themselves. If this were happening at banks, or airports, or power plants, we would call it a coordinated campaign. If your bank just went offline, and there was a repeatable pattern, we would be looking into that. We don't mess with money. We'd be asking who's behind it, and why or what do they want. The only reason we're not asking those questions right now at scale is because the answer might not be human, and the government intends to keep it hidden. The question then that emerges from this pattern is why nuclear weapons specifically? There are essentially 3 interpretations that most of the community has proposed. The first is surveillance. Whatever these objects are, they're monitoring our nuclear capabilities the way an adversary would, assessing readiness, testing response times, cataloging vulnerabilities. Under this interpretation, the shutdowns were probes. The second is deterrence. The objects are trying to send a message. Hey, look at me. I can turn this off. I can neutralize your most destructive weapons whenever I want. The Malmstrom shutdowns weren't a probe. They definitely felt like a demonstration. And the third connects back to the Ariel school encounter we covered last episode. The children reported a telepathic warning about environmental destruction, about humanity harming this planet. If whatever intelligence is behind these tic-tac objects and these events has a concern about existential threats on Earth, and nuclear weapons are definitely existential threats, then the nuclear pattern isn't random, it's focused. I need to be clear too, I am speculating here, which I shouldn't be doing, but I am. Because as a software engineer and a math brain, patterns are everything I see. Pattern of UAP activity at nuclear sites is literally documented. The interpretation of that pattern is speculative, but if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, patterns tell me it's probably a duck. What do you think? I've got a lot of thoughts, but here's what we know. On March 16th, 1967, all 10 Minuteman I nuclear missiles in Echo flight at Malmstrom Air Force Base simultaneously dropped off strategic alert status. One of the two officers in the capsule, Walter Figel, stated on tape that a security guard reported a large round object hovering over one of the missile silos, and that a security alert team confirmed that sighting. The other officer, Eric Carlson, denies any UFO involvement. The official unit history says the rumors were disproven, but it does not explain how. Boeing engineer Robert Kaminsky investigated and found the missiles were perfect. No technical explanation for the shutdown. He was told UFOs were being reported, and then the Air Force shut down his investigation. 8 days later, on March 24th, all 10 missiles in Oscar flight went down under similar circumstances. First Lieutenant Robert Salas received reports of a glowing red-orange object hovering over the front gate of the missile silo. He watched his missiles go offline in real time, 60 feet underground. Captain Mywald confirmed the shutdown on tape. First Lieutenant Jamison confirmed that targeting teams were held at base until the UFO reports ceased. Strategic Air Command's classified assessment, grave concern. And yet, the official position, technical malfunction. But the contractor who investigated says no technical cause exists or could be identified. Classified telex says no explanation was found. And multiple witnesses, on tape under their real names in front of cameras at the National Press Club, say unidentified objects were hovering over those weapons. 20 nuclear missiles, 8 days, and zero explanation. Robert Salas kept his silence for nearly 30 years before a book in a university bookstore gave him the permission to speak. Walter Figel went on tape but stayed out of the spotlight. Eric Carlson just denies everything. Robert Kaminsky's investigation was shut down before it was completed. And Robert Hastings has spent 50 years building a case that no institution has ever been willing to formally even evaluate. Something is watching our nuclear weapons. And at Malmstrom, in March of 1967, it showed us it can't just watch, it can also tinker. It shut them down. Whether that's a warning, a demonstration, or something we don't yet have a framework to understand, the question really deserves to be taken seriously. Because the Air Force's own words, grave concern, suggests that even they know the official story isn't enough to keep this contained. We are under observation. The question is, what? Thanks for listening to episode 4 of Under Observation. Next episode, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're stepping away from the case files to ask a question that sounds a little ridiculous at first, I'll agree, but leads somewhere genuinely interesting. If aliens are so smart, why are they always naked? We're going to dig into what abduction reports actually say about gray alien biology, the Avatar hypothesis, and what the whole question reveals about the assumptions we bring to non-human intelligence. That's coming really soon. Until then, keep looking up to the secrets in the sky.